Thank you for joining us on the Ultimate Leadership Podcast. And here's your host, Chris Saunders.
Well, once again, I want to thank you for joining us on the Ultimate Leadership Podcast. I got to tell you, every time that you guys spend some time and, click the listen button, I feel really humbled. Those numbers are starting to creep up, and I'm really excited about the emails and the comments that we get about the show. And I appreciate everybody taking the time to give me their opinions about the show, and we certainly take those comments to heart. A couple shows back, we had the opportunity to chat with Grace Saunders, and she's our resident expert, I think, when it comes to time management. And she really kind of outlined for us the importance of investing in time and really getting away from that whole time management. She gave us some really practical tips, and, she gave us some tools to, kind of utilize. And it was really important, I think, to have her back and to kind of talk about time investment and how we can really get the most out of our time. And I just want to go ahead and introduce her again. Grace Saunders is the founder and CEO of Real Life E. It's a time coaching and training company that partners with individuals on the journey from guilty, overwhelmed, and frustrated to accomplishing more with peace and confidence. She's an accomplished author. She's appeared in Inc. magazine, the Chicago Tribune. You've seen her on NBC, ABC, and CBS. And she was selected one of the top 25 amazing women of the year by Stiletto Women. And here she is once again joining us, Grace Saunders. Elizabeth, thanks for coming back to the show.
My pleasure.
And I got to tell you, the last time we had you on, you really kind of gave us some practical experience. You gave us some practical tips and tools that we could use. And I really thought that it was important that maybe we now start to focus on the realistic expectations when it comes to investing in our time. So I guess the first question I have for you is, I know you shared our story in the last podcast on priorities. Maybe you could just give that brief intro for the new listeners that may not have heard it to kind of recap what we talked about last time.
I'd be delighted to. So in terms of the very short story of how I got into doing what I'm doing, what happened is that I did not have realistic expectations about how much I could fit in a day or a week. And I also didn't have realistic expectations about how to balance out work with life. I was running a company where I did writing, editing, and photo styling for magazines and also marketing firms. And I never had a time where I felt like I could relax without guilt. And somehow I just magically thought everything would fit in the day or everything would fit in the week without actually planning my time and seeing if that was really true. So that was my struggle. I overcame that struggle and then started to help other people on this process of transformation to a place where they're really investing time in their priorities and also having realistic expectations. And I've just had the privilege of working with clients around the world on this for the last 8.5 years.
In our last show, you really kind of gave us the concept of time investment rather than time management. I really like that because, again, I've said that you can't really manage time. You can only manage your processes within time. So now we're going to talk about realistic expectations, as you just kind of briefed us on. Why is that so important?
It's really essential because if you don't have realistic expectations, you set yourself up for constantly feeling like a failure. And it's so sad because here's an example I can give you. So let's say that you believe a project will take you 8 hours to accomplish, and the project ends up taking you 10 hours. How do you feel? You probably feel a little frustrated. You feel a little like, oh, I'm behind on this other stuff, or I had to work late, or, I just wish this had been faster. I'd been more efficient.
I'd be happy with 10 more than I'd be happy with 16, though. I got to tell you that.
Yeah, there you go. That's
right.
True. That's true. But then let's say you thought a project would take 8 hours, and it takes 8 hours. How would you feel? You feel good. You're like, yeah, cool. Like I thought it would take 8 hours. It took 8 hours. All is well with the world. We even work on time. Getting to go to work out. All is well. And now let's say you thought a project would take 8 hours, and it took you 6 hours. How would you feel? Oh my gosh, you would feel amazing. You would feel on top of the world. You would feel like the coolest person ever who now gets to get all this extra stuff done in the next 2 hours that you all of a sudden have free. Like your life is the best life in the entire world. And in this scenario, what we're looking at is it didn't have to do with how long so much a project took, but it had to do with what were your expectations of how long it would take. And so if your expectations are that things will take you a very short time, or that you can finish 15 big projects in a day, and then you don't do that, you go around beating yourself up all the time and feeling like a horrible failure when that's completely unnecessary. But when you have realistic expectations of what's possible or not possible, you can really set yourself up for not only being a success, but feeling like a success, which is super important.
And I think that one of the things that we really have to do is we really got to be able to have those realistic expectations to really give us that feeling that we're not getting behind the eight ball. But I guess the question I have for you is, would you say that most people use this? Do they have realistic expectations with their time?
I'm smiling over here. No.
I thought that was a rhetorical question, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I'm thinking most people no. In my experience, most people think that time is an ever-flowing flow of abundance that has no limits and has no definition. And they get horribly confused when they find out that reality always wins. And the reality is there's 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week, and that every choice you make to spend your time in a certain way is a choice you make to not spend it in another way. So that hour you spend, answering email is an hour that you don't have working on the report. And when people are not in alignment with reality and not in alignment with realism, they end up being horribly disappointed and overwhelmed.
One of the things that you talked about in the first show was really scheduling your time. And you just mentioned that, what if it takes you 8 hours to do a project? What if it takes you 6 hours? How are you going to feel about that? And actually, I share with people that they need to put those projects on their calendar as well. So if I think a project is going to take me 8 hours and I'm going to do that over the course of a week, I'm scheduling project time during that time. So I know that I'm going to do 2 hours today, 2 hours tomorrow, 2 hours on Friday, and really it's going to get me to that end. And when you talk about realistic expectations, I think it gives the opportunity to make those realistic expectations to say, I'm going to try to get this done. And then as you're scheduling that by day 3 or day 2, you may know that it's going to take you 10 hours. But I guess the question I have for you now is, how can someone tell if they have realistic expectations?
Yeah, no, and I love what you just shared about blocking in the time. That's so wise. And it leads us to the point of, how can people tell if they have realistic expectations? And I would say that if you are consistently able to meet the deadline that you set for yourself or others, if you're leaving margin for things taking longer than expected, which often happens, like you made the joke about, I'd be happy if it only took 10 hours versus 16, with a project that you think will take 8. And if they're consistently feeling good about what they're accomplishing in a day, at least I would say about 90% of the time, I would say you're definitely someone that has realistic expectations. If on the contrary, you just constantly feel behind, you constantly feel like, what's my problem? Why can't I keep up? You're not translating the work you have to your calendar and seeing if it fits. You're constantly saying yes to things and never saying no, then you're probably someone that does not have realistic expectations about how much can fit in a day or a week.
Yeah, and I think that really is important. And I gotta guess that as you're starting to now transform into realistic expectations, this is something that isn't going to happen in a day. I mean, you've got to be able to train yourself now to get to this point.
Yeah.
But I think that as we now start to do this, people are maybe they're going to feel overwhelmed. Maybe they're going to feel overloaded. And I would really like for you to share some tips at this point about how we can avoid that feeling of being overwhelmed or being overloaded. And I know that you have another book out. We talked about your first book on the last show, and hopefully the listeners out there took some opportunity to check out the 3 Secrets to Effective Time Management. But I know that you have another one that talks about how to invest your time like money, which I love that title. I got to think that there's got to be some tips in there to talk about to kind of help the people who feel overwhelmed or overloaded.
Absolutely. So for those people who are feeling overwhelmed and overloaded, in my second book, How to Invest Your Time Like Money, that you just mentioned, we start out with this idea of identifying your time debt, because often what is happening is that you're basically running your schedule constantly in debt, like basically on credit. You're committing to things that you don't actually have time for, and that's what leads to the stress. So the first thing that can be really essential, and I go into it in a lot of detail on how to invest your time like money, is to list out all the different parts of your life and how much time it takes to invest in those. So I'll just run through a few examples of what that can look like. There's more details in the book. But for example, let's say you commute to work and it takes about an hour round trip. Well, that would be an hour, in the day. Let's say you need to work 40 hours a week. That would be 40. Let's say that you have, a sports activity that you like to do. That maybe takes 3 hours a week, so on and so forth. You go down and you list out, okay, what are the different parts of my life that are either very tangible items like going to work or commuting or sports activity, or even just intrinsic things that I'm telling myself are important. So for example, I know you mentioned in our different conversations that you're working on Italian, and so that's something that is intrinsically important to you and that you want to spend a certain amount of time on. So you list all of those out, and then you tally them up. And you compare that to the time budget actually available in the day or the week. And if you're finding that your total of the expectations exceeds your total of the time available, you are in time debt. And this isn't the problem. It's a great thing. Recognition is the first step. Acceptance is the first step that you have an issue, and you're not alone. We all have done this. We all do this, and it's natural and it's normal. Once you have really figured out in a very tangible, practical way that things actually don't all fit in your schedule, then you can really start to take action, not from a place of guilt where you just feel so guilty that you have to say no to people or so guilty that you have to make cuts, but from a place of empowerment where you realize, I don't want to live my life in time debt. I want to live my life authentically and truly and freely. And so when you can start to do that, then you can begin to make cuts from the areas you consider to be lower priorities. In our last podcast, we talked about how to do priorities-based decision making. And when you're doing that, you're saying, okay, if I'm in time debt, I want to make sure that I'm really saving time for my top priorities. But maybe some of these lower priority items that are nice but not necessary, that's where I need to start making cuts so I can get to a balanced time budget and I can really feel good about what I'm doing or not doing. And in that book, How to Invest Your Time Like Money, it will talk you through how to start making those cuts and make those decisions so that you can get to a balanced budget. And if I wanted to encourage someone with one very, 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 very simple tip, that would be try to say no at least once a week, if not once a day when you're starting out. And the saying no could be something as simple as saying no to reading an extra article or saying no to a responsibility that comes up, or even saying no to yourself in terms of overloading your schedule. And by training yourself to begin to say no, not even necessarily to other people, but just to things coming your way, not engaging with them, you can begin to get towards a more realistic place where you're really saying yes to those priorities, those things on your calendar, those things on your to-do list that really matter to you.
Yeah, I love to say no to the kids all the time, so I think that works out. So, we've now invested a lot of time in, talking about time management and all the things that, in time investment. But I really want to now get to the crux of those people that we know that maybe are a little bit disorganized, or the people that are typically late on a regular basis. What advice do you have for those people that now can, I guess, maybe change or pick up some of the skills they need to be a little bit more organized and to get to their responsibilities on time?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's very, very essential for people who are typically late or disorganized is that they have to come to terms with the fact that organization takes time, and also that so far we're not able to teleport. So getting from one place to another takes time. And I know that sounds really funny, but a lot of times people that are perpetually late, they won't literally think about the fact, oh, I need to walk down the hall to get to the meeting, and that takes 3 minutes. Or I need to get in the car and drive somewhere, and that takes time. So for people that are typically late or perpetually disorganized, just coming to terms with the fact that organization takes time, or getting someplace or doing something on time takes time is an important first step. Then from there, what I found in terms of people being more on time and having realistic expectations with that is it's really good to learn what your internal thermometer is. And so I'm going to give you an example of what this means. So when I was living in the home previous to the one I live now, it was an older home, and we had an older oven. And it was an older oven, and it was one of those ones with the old-fashioned kind of dial on the front versus the fancy digital, you put in the temperature that you want it to be. And the dial was a little bit off. And so let's say you put the oven, you thought you were putting the oven at 350 degrees because that's the temperature for your cookies to bake. Well, your cookies would end up burned, because the truth was that the oven was really about 375, so it was about 25 degrees hotter than it was actually reading on the measurement of the temperature. And so I learned over time that if I didn't want my food to burn, I needed to set it lower, so let's say like 325. And then my food didn't burn, and all was well with the world. So with people that are late, you need to figure out, well, what's my set point? So let's say their set point is being 10 minutes late or 30 minutes late or something like that. If you know that that's your set point, you kind of need to psych yourself out and to tell yourself something like, for example, let's say you're typically 10 minutes late. You want to start telling yourself, oh, I'm going to try to be 10 or 15 minutes early. And if you aim for that, and you kind of, like if you need to be someplace at 11, and you keep telling yourself, I really want to get there by 10:45, I really want to get there by 10:45. If I get there by 10:45, then maybe I can spend some time listening to a podcast or reading an article I want to do. You're probably going to end up right on time at 11. But if you aim for 11, you're going to be there at 11:15. So just like little tweaks that you can do to figure out your set point and what you need to tell yourself. And then secondly, in regards to people that are typically disorganized and coming to this place of acceptance, it's really about setting aside rituals. Maybe it's 30 minutes a day that you set aside to clean up the house or do chores, or maybe it's having 5 minutes at the end of the day to file paper on your desk. Whatever that is, you're setting aside time, you're recognizing that organization takes time, and you can really put yourself in a place of feeling on top of things instead of always wondering, why am I always late? Or why am I always disorganized?
And I got to tell you, I don't know what's worse, showing up 10 or 15 minutes late to an appointment or burning them cookies. So I think that I'm going to lean towards the cookies right now. So, but Elizabeth, no matter sometimes how hard you work with people and you try to coach them and you try to guide them, why is it that some people just do not want to have realistic expectations? Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, because it makes them angry. They're like, it's not fair. I want to do the 500 things that are in my head, and I don't understand why I can't do them all right now today. And so, and that's okay. And that's part of the process. And I'm so proud of my coaching clients that acknowledge those feelings, recognize they're there, and then are willing to work through them and to get to a place of accepting reality. But I just want all the listeners to know, if it makes you angry that there's only 24 hours in a day, that is okay. It's fine. And in time, you will come to a place of acceptance.
So let's go ahead and flip the coin now. What about unrealistic expectations of others or by others? I mean, how do you manage those in your life?
Absolutely. So this is something where the whole saying no is really, 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 really essential. And communication is really essential. If you don't tell people that they're overloading you or something is too much, they can't know, and that is not their fault. So it's really important that we take ownership versus putting ourselves in a victim stance. In order to do that in very practical, tactical ways, I know in our last podcast I referenced this, but I'll reference this again. I do have a guide to saying no nicely, and that's part of setting those expectations with people about what is or is not reasonable. And I'll give you an example of one way to do that. So let's say that you have a colleague that comes up to your desk and is asking you for something by the end of the day or by tomorrow morning. And if you're someone that has not planned your day, doesn't have a sense of your priorities, it's going to be a really hard question for you to answer, because you'll be like, well, they want it by the end of the day or they want it by tomorrow morning. I want to make them happy. I should just say yes and just do it. But if you have taken that time to define your priorities, like we talked about in the first podcast, if you have realistic expectations, so you've done what you recommended very wisely, Chris, of putting that time in your calendar for those things you want to get done today, when someone asks you that kind of question, like, can you get this done by the end of the day or can you get it done by tomorrow morning, you can then look over to your calendar, see what you currently have on your plate, and see if there's any time slots available. And it's a funny thing. If there's no time available, no, you can't get it done by that time, unless it's such a high priority that it's worth shifting something you currently have on your agenda to another time. So what that might sound like in terms of a script would be, Mary, I'd be really happy to work on this for you. I'm already booked for the rest of today and some tomorrow morning, but I can definitely get this to you by tomorrow afternoon. Then what you do is you put in your calendar when you're going to work on that specific item that you were asked to get done, and you can deliver that to her the next afternoon. So saying, quote unquote, no to people or setting realistic expectations doesn't have to be abrasive. It doesn't have to be offensive, but it is about being clear. And in the guide I have on how to say no nicely, which you can get by texting just say no, all one word, lowercase, to 33444, and then responding with your email or clicking on the link near this podcast, is something that shares other tips of how we can gently, kindly, yet clearly let people know what's realistic versus saying yes to something, having no time to do it, staying up till midnight and being so resentful that how could they ask me to do this and I didn't have even time to get this done by tomorrow morning.
That sounds so simple. So I guess now what we have to do is we just have to put all that in practice. Between, our first show and this show, I think you've given us some really great tips that will allow us to really think about time investment and then having realistic expectations. And again, I have so many more questions. I think you need to come back. Let's go ahead and do another show. And I'd really like to talk about, how we can develop routines and, into this process and how we can really make this flow. So promise me you'll come back one more time. And let's have we'll have the trilogy, almost like a Star Wars episode.
Sounds awesome. Can't wait.
So I want to thank our guest, Elizabeth Grace Saunders. She is our resident expert on time management. And everybody out there, hopefully you got a little bit out of the show now that you're able to really put those realistic expectations and manage unrealistic expectations by people who are around you and really kind of make the best out of your day. So for everybody out there, I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Cebollero. I look forward to chatting with everyone again real soon.
Thank you for joining us. The Ultimate Leadership Podcast is a production of ChrisCebollero.com. You can interact with us by email at ultimateleadership16@gmail.com. All rights reserved.